I didn't grow up in the South. I grew up in Colorado, a state that defies regional description. Not the Midwest, not fully the West, just Colorado, the middle. But living in Houston is not my first sojourn into the South. In rabbinical school, I had a student pulpit in High Point, North Carolina. Once a month, I would travel there to spend Shabbat. Living in New York at the time, I was ready for the change of pace. It was great to get out of the relentless hustle of the city. People moved a little slower. People talked a lot slower. People were, nice. If you have heard of High Point, it is probably because it was once the furniture capital of the world. It was also the hosiery capital of the world, but somehow that name was less sticky. So in the middle of town, there is a sculpture, a 3-story bedroom dresser with gigantic socks hanging out of the drawer, a strange but fitting testament to the industries that made the town thrive. It was the centerpiece of my driving tour with one of the congregants' leaders on my first visit to High Point. It came into view as we turned a corner, and I was speechless. Some towns have giant balls of twine. High Point has a giant chest of drawers. On the same tour, Howard, my guide, showed me the once sprawling metropolis. Most of the buildings now stand empty. Furniture and hosiery production has moved overseas. But there is a small and growing college there. The city is down but not out. As we were driving through the neighborhoods, he kept pointing out to me private schools, one after another. It felt like there were a lot of them, and so I asked him about it. "Sure," said Howard in his slow southern drawl. "There are tons of private schools here and all across the South. These are the schools white families set up to avoid desegregation." He told me these schools are still going strong, how High Point is still very much a divided community. Suddenly, a different South started to emerge, not just the South of quaint accents and oversized dressers, but the South of complex stories and ongoing tensions. This was when my recently acquired Yankee judgment kicked in. In some parts of the country, segregation had ended, but in the South, they had fought to maintain it long after Brown versus the Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act. As a Coloradoan, I felt pretty high and mighty driving through that High Point neighborhood. It was only later that I realized that the story of school segregation was my own story too, even in Colorado. I went to Cherry Creek High School, along one of the best public schools in the state. It is in a wealthy, suburban, high-achieving community. We were once voted second snootiest school in the country by David Letterman, and someone supposedly called to ask if we could buy first. And we are big. My graduating class was over 900 students, and of them, 11 were African American. I graduated from high school in 2003. I didn't go to private school, but for all intents and purposes, I did go to a segregated school. This past Wednesday, Emanu hosted an event celebrating the 65th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. I saw many of you there, and those who were can attest that it was an inspiring evening, but it was not uplifting. Over and over, our speakers stressed that our schools are more segregated than they have been in decades. After Brown, segregation no longer takes the form of public schools explicitly for white children, but in many parts of the country, the outcome is still the same. As one of our speakers said on Wednesday, districts are the new segregation lines. According to a recent New York Times article, more than half of the nation's school children are in racially concentrated districts where over 75% of students are either white or non-white. And these school districts that predominantly serve students of color receive $23 billion less in funding than mostly white school districts in the United States, despite serving the same number of students. The Supreme Court made it clear in Brown that there is no way for separate to be equal. This is true now as ever. And these differences in funding translate to differences in education and outcomes. I learned this year in my work on school finance reform that reading by the end of third grade is a critical measure. In fourth grade, students go from what is called learning to read to reading to learn. They are no longer just reading books to get better at reading, now they are reading textbooks to learn content. A student who cannot read by the fourth grade starts to fall behind, and with each passing day, it becomes harder and harder to catch up. In HISD, only 1/3 of black fourth graders can read at grade level. Compare that with 3/4 of white students. Race is not the only way our schools are segregated. Race is intimately tied to economics, and the economic disparities are just as stark. According to the Houston Chronicle, HISD has a childhood poverty rate of 37%, and 76.4% of its students are considered economically disadvantaged, while in neighboring Katy ISD, there's a childhood poverty rate of only 8.4%, and only 28.3% of its students are economically disadvantaged. That's a nearly 30-point gap, well off the 7-point national average for neighboring districts. In an act of tragic irony, I was taught in my almost all-white school that Brown versus the Board of Education had ended racial segregation in America. And in an act of unfathomable privilege, I believed it. The story I was taught growing up was that the work of the 1950s and 60s had represented unreversible forward progress. The story I heard on Wednesday night was a story of racial integration that has been flawed from the start and subject to much backsliding. On Wednesday, Brown was celebrated, but it was also lamented. The segregation we see today is even more pernicious, even more intractable than that of the segregation before the Civil Rights Movement. What I hailed as a blessing had kept me from seeing a curse. Having seen and acknowledged this fact, I now have to cope with the world that is a lot more complex, which is, for lack of a better word, less black and white. This week's Torah portion, Bechukotai, is the last in the book of Leviticus. The book ends with a list of blessings and curses. If the Israelites follow God's laws, everything will be great. Their crops will grow, their families will flourish, they will vanquish their enemies. But if they fail to follow God's laws, everything will fall apart. They will be spurned by God, starved by famine, and scattered to the winds. To me, this is a theology that is almost foreign in its simplicity. Do good, all blessings. Do bad, terrible curses. But that's not how the world works. Progress and regress are not opposites but partners, and we can only hope to make more steps forward than back. Perhaps this is why the section on blessings and curses ends a bit muddled. After explaining how God will reject and exile the cursed people, the text goes on to say, "Yet even then, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not forget them or spurn them so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant with them. For I, the Eternal, am their God. I will remember in their favor the covenant with their ancestors." After setting up this strict dichotomy of blessings versus curses, suddenly the separation is not so clear. I will exile you, but I will not forsake you. I will spurn you, but I will not abandon you. This chapter reads like the story of our lives. We start out with a simplistic, naive understanding of the world, but as we grow and mature, we come to see and appreciate the complexity. Would that real life were as simple as blessings and curses. In truth, life is a mixture of cursed blessings and blessed curses. These past few months, our congregants joined with Reformed Jews from all over the state through the newly formed Religious Action Center of Texas in a campaign for school finance reform. And 1 week ago, the bill for which we advocated, HB 3, passed both the House and the Senate unanimously. It is a historic piece of legislation, the first time the state has seriously addressed the question of school finance reform in decades. The state's 5.4 million public school students will all feel the benefit of this investment of $6 billion new education dollars. The law will invest more state money in public schools, raise teacher and staff compensation, protect equity for low-income students, and provide funds for full-day pre-K. It is a major step forward. And our movement had a hand in making this happen. Congregants went to Austin to lobby, made calls to their senators and representatives, and had conversations with local school board members, education activists, parents, students, and teachers. Though we certainly cannot take all or most of the credit, we played a small part in this historic victory for Texas's children. But this victory is not all blessing. Like Brown versus the Board of Education, like all grown-up blessings, really, it contains curses too. This bill does not do enough to ensure funding in future budgets. It does not do enough to eliminate discrimination and segregation. And our state is $14 billion behind the national average in per-student spending. This influx of $6 billion does not get us even halfway to closing that gap. And that's halfway to the average in our country. It's going to take many more bills like this one until we can truly say we are investing in our students. We have done something amazing, and yet we have not done enough, not nearly enough. It is progress, but like all progress, it is imperfect. And maybe, ultimately, that is the message we need to take from the events of this week, from the passage of HB 3, from our reconsideration of Brown versus the Board of Education, even from our Torah portion. We need the ability to see the blessings in our curses and the curses in our blessings. When we delude ourselves into thinking that something can only be good or bad, we hold ourselves back. Brown versus the Board of Education was a landmark decision, but like all landmarks, it is best used to plot our path forward. To accept something as only a blessing or a curse is to see the story as finished, but the story is not finished. The last verses of the 26th chapter of Leviticus remind us of this fact. And yet, even then, I will not give up, says God. You may think that you are cursed, you may think that you are down and out, but I am not done with your story. The moment we can acknowledge that even a giant leap is not the end of the journey is the moment we open ourselves to the possibility of progress. We are not done, not nearly done, fighting for justice, fighting for equality, fighting for our children. Let us celebrate the progress we have made, and let us acknowledge our failures along the way so that we can move bravely forward. Shabbat Shalom.